Hello again. So, what we've talked about so far is the gradual rise of the number of universities and a very small increase in the number of people going to university. So, for example, if you remember in 1950 it was 3.4% of 18-year-olds, and by 1960 that had risen just marginally to 4.6%. So, even after the end of the Second World War, the NHS, the welfare state, a lot of changes, not much had really happened to tackle the issue of access to university education. What began the process of significantly altering the way ahead was the 1963 Robbins Report. That was actually commissioned by the government back in 1961, and it's a landmark report which effectively still sets the policy basis for further education today. And its keystone statement said, university places should be available to all who were qualified for them by ability and attainment. And that's very much the first time that any government, any policy statement had been made, which suggested that rather than being something which a very privileged few should access, that university places should be available to everyone who was able to take them up. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion still around what it means by ability and attainment, but this was very much setting in stone the idea that all those who were able to take up a university place should have the opportunity to do it. But what the Robbins Report did, in effect, was then pose a continuing policy challenge to governments of every party of how to deliver university places for everyone qualified to take them up within the constraints of money and financing and the infrastructure, that is, the numbers of universities and the places that those universities could provide. And clearly, when the Robbins Report was published and only around 5% of 18-year-olds was able to go to university because of money or because of the number of places, every government that succeeded after the Robbins Report had to deal with the challenge of expanding university places and finding ways of expanding the funding for university places and students so that much greater numbers of young people could take up places. And the Robbins Report also identified four main social policy objectives for the purpose of higher education. And those were instruction in skills, the promotion of general powers of mind to produce cultivated men and women, to maintain research, and transmit a common culture and common standards of citizenship. Now, obviously, those four key objectives that the Robbins Report identified sound in some ways quite dated to us 57, 58 years on. Instruction in skills probably stands the test of time. I'm not sure that to produce cultivated men and women is something we'd talk about today. Research probably remains very valid, but the idea of transmitting a common culture and common standards of citizenship probably isn't these days seen as something that universities would be responsible for. Later on, we'll talk about something called the Augar Review that was commissioned a few years ago by the current government to look into the future of university education and fees. And the objectives that were set for the Augar Review, that the government saw as the purposes of university education, were indeed very different. And it's quite interesting to set alongside each other the objectives back in 1963 of the Robbins Report and where the government of today sees the purpose and meaning of university education. So when the Robbins Report was published, there were then 24 universities in the UK. In the next decade, over the next 10 years or so, that essentially doubled. 23 more were added. Some were already underway when Robbins was published, but it was absolutely a major catalyst for expansion to meet the demand for places for all those who were qualified to receive a university education, as we talked about in the Robbins Key Statement. But in many ways just as important and perhaps sometimes overlooked, back in 1960, in a preparation for the work of the Robbins Committee in its report, the Anderson Committee had recommended how funding of university places should be tackled going forward. And the Anderson Committee report recommended mandatory student grants for those given places and the abolition of what existed then as the parental means test. Now, the second part of that, not testing parents' income as a way of calculating student grants and support, was not taken up at the time. But mandatory student grants, that is, access to funding for every individual who achieved a university place, was something that successive governments would then put in place. And for the next 30 years, for a generation or so, the state, through taxation, providing student grants, would be the basis by which individuals would be able to take up the university places that they were qualified for by their abilities and attainment. So clearly, it is taking together the effects of the Anderson report and the Robbins report, which opened up university education greatly across the country for the next generations. If everyone who was able by their abilities to qualify for a university place, however that was defined, was able to have one and entitled to have one, and if the state was going to provide funding through taxation to support them for their fees and indeed for their living costs, then it's possible to see how you would have the great increase in student numbers that followed on from Anderson and Robbins. But as well as setting the ground rules for how university education should develop over the coming 30 years, they also set the scene for the policy debates which would follow then and very much follow after 1990 or so, as to essentially how all this was to be paid for. Would it be right indeed that general taxation should fund a very small still number of people with all the privileges and benefits of a university education that they were going to enjoy, and of course the economic benefits they might well enjoy for future earnings as a result of a university degree? Interestingly, the Anderson Committee debated the idea of student loans to provide for fees and living expenses when they were debating what to put forward in their report, but at that time decided against it. A major reason at the time, as Robbins also noted, was a belief that it would seriously disadvantage female candidates for university places, as families would be willing to take on loans to borrow to send their sons to university, but not their daughters. Obviously, this now seems very strange to us, but it does reflect perhaps the reality of the time in the early 1960s. And one of the main changes we would see over time in the generation or so would follow, of course, is that as well as a significant increase in the overall numbers of people being able to go to university, the gender balance between male and female would change very substantially and would continue to change up to the present day. I want to go on to talk in some detail now about student fees themselves, something I'm sure that's very important to all of you. Where did the idea of student fees begin? How did we get to where we are today? What happens next as a result of the Augar Review, as a result of the COVID pandemic and the impacts of that? And perhaps to leave you with the question of, if it was up to you and you had to make the political, social policy decisions around student fees going forward, what is it you would do? What objectives would be your priorities? Because as governments and politicians of every kind have found over the last 30 years, this is definitely one of those areas where you can't really achieve every policy objective, every good that you're looking to do, because one thing does affect another. And just finally, really, in this section of the lecture, let me talk about two myths about fees. First, the idea that fees were invented in 1998. In fact, student fees, paying for the education part of being at university, had always been in place. It was really just a question of who paid them. Universities had been charging fees for students, but the costs were picked up by the local education authority, paid for by general taxation and channeled through the government. So fees existed. The issue was who was responsible for paying for them. And secondly, that student fees today pay for university education. In fact, across the board, Universities UK reckon student fees fund about 53%, 55% or so. The majority, but only a very small majority, of the costs of the university sector in providing for a university education. And last year, I think, when I looked at Bath, student fees funded about £165 million out of the university's budget of £290 million. So obviously the fees you pay, the fees that all student pays, are absolutely essential to university finances, essential to paying for university places, but they are not the only source of income for the university, and indeed they only represent just over half of the total income of the university. And those numbers vary slightly between different universities, but they are broadly the same. So student fees are absolutely essential, but they're not the only thing that matters for university income. We'll just take a break here and we'll resume shortly. Thanks.